you strip the will of the individual or group, you are taking away what Aristotle called their entelechy. Entelechy is their soul. This has been illustrated throughout the United States history concerning African Americans for over 500 years. Thus is why we call it the African American experience. It is not the African American culture. The experimenters have been stripping away cultural variants from our ancestral ties to Africa. African tribal traditions, beliefs, and values has been lost in translation or transition due to slavery. Most African Americans are unable to trace their ancestral roots due to the inadequate record keeping during the Middle Passage, known as the transatlantic slave trade. That started in 1441 and lasted until 1870, meaning there's a big gap in history that has been unable to be filled relating to African ancestral ties for African Americans. Therefore, self-conscious era of cultural identity exists. The African American cognitive thought process has been manufactured for them through the dominant culture, which is the white culture. It's the equivalent of a car being processed on an assembly line. The African American social cultural identity has been constructed for them through the use of conscious and subconscious efforts, whether that be gender, culture, sexual orientation, ethnicity, religion, social class, disability, and language. It all has been socially constructed in such a way for African Americans where they have no remnants, ties, or cultural link back in Africa, and this was intentionally done. One of the biggest weapons to be used on a people for the purpose of demise besides the atomic bomb is acculturation. The reason why I have race crossed out, as you can see, we are all part of one species, humanity. Although most human beings forget that concept, Maslow's hierarchy of needs illustrates that we are here for one common goal, survival. It's just some ethnic groups go through the concept of survival through different means. The process of survival begins from the day of conception to the very last breath we take. We allow differences to separate us instead of letting commonalities bring us together. Race is another connotation for racism. They have intentionally formed the word to have us divided amongst each other and fight against each other. While race is ascribed to individuals on the basis of physical traits, ethnicity is more frequently chosen by the individual. Anthropologist Nina Jablonski's research on skin color revealed that we all come from one source. The migration patterns out of Africa helped the human species adapt to their environment. Therefore, human skin color had to adapt to ensure survival based on the region, which means the tool used for dividing the human species through the use of race is infectiously inadequate. African Americans are more subjective to the United States ethnic culture that has caused what I call an identity crisis. This is what we are experiencing now, is an identity crisis that African American communities, within the African American communities. Eric Erickson, the theory of psychosocial development. When adolescents are apathetic, do not make a conscious search for identity, or are pressured to conform to their parents' ideas for the future, they may develop a weak sense of self, in turn, experience role confusion. African Americans have been assigned to a role, has been assigned a role to play in the United States by the dominant group. The further we get from the source, the greater the weak sense of self and role confusion. If you don't know where you have been, how do you know where you need to go? That has been the very existence of the African American culture. For cultural identity to work, it has to be on a linear scale, with the individual or group being able to answer these three questions. 1, what is culture? 2, where is culture? And 3, how can culture be an access? For many African Americans, we are unable to answer those pertinent questions to help form what I call a solid cultural foundation to decrease a likelihood of identity crisis within our communities. Psychologically, we have become externally displaced from Africa and internally displaced in the United States of America. A child learns to adapt their behavior to their environment by mimicking those who influence their environment, which majority of the time is a parental figure. This is the same concept being used as psychological controlling factor within the African American communities. The dominant group acts in the U.S. as a parental figure to the African Americans with external influences that penetrate the African American community. Then we internalize our behaviors. Therefore, it becomes a learned concept, making certain aspects of acculturation possible. The dominant group uses an authoritarian parenting style over the African American community, thus inciting systematic neglect through social, physical, psychological, and economic channels. African Americans evolved to adapt to ensure their survival here within the United States over a long period of time. Therefore, when you do that, and when you have the dominant culture being a parent culture to the less dominant culture, the effect is the subordinate culture. We as African Americans lose a piece of ourselves every day, and every time you lose a piece of your cultural identity, we call it an identity crisis. For acculturation to become effective, it must work on all three levels as listed here: macro, meso, and micro. The macro are parents in society that makes the rules for people in society, such as governments. The meso is the African American community. The micro is the individual itself. The group or individual will develop, learn, and perform for it to become an overarching, efficient process on all three levels. If the individual or group are unable to develop, learn, and perform on all the levels, the individual or group may experience acculturative stress. Berry and Company applied 4 strategies for acculturation: separation, marginalization, integration, and assimilation. I have applied these 4 strategies to African American acculturation. The first process was separation. In 1526, separation began when the first laborers arrived in what is now present-day South Carolina. These slaves revolted against the Spanish colonies that brought them to the strange lands of America. A year later, the revolt dismantled the Spanish colonies to the point the Spanish abandoned the territory. African slaves detested being physically torn from their land, which is an understatement, by the way, then being stripped their identity by those that treated them like animals on a farm. The second process, marginalization. Marginalization was experienced after the end of slavery during the Reconstruction period. For the duration of that period, you had these free Black people trying to be sharecroppers, teachers, or take similar jobs as their white counterparts. Instead of maintaining the indigenous West African spiritual, polytheistic, and animistic practices, most African Americans, i.e. former slaves, formed Baptist and Methodist churches, now accepting the fact that their new God is a white man with blonde hair and blue eyes. Marginalization is illustrated by the dominant group through exclusion of the subordinate group. Although the subordinate group takes on basic value system of the dominant group for survival purposes only. The third process was integration. The integration process for African Americans mainly happened throughout the Jim Crow era. This is when African Americans no longer wanted to be separate but equal. And in my opinion, we were never equal, always remained separate. African Americans during that time were trying to integrate into the dominant group's culture, white people being less tolerant. This strategy requires a non-dominant group, i.e. African American community, to adopt basic values of white society. In return, white society will accept a subordinate ethnoculture group, like children, while the dominant group systematically embraces the subordinate group through education, politics, social changes, economics, labor, health, and housing, and etc. The last process is where we're at currently today. Full-on assimilation. Presently, the majority of African Americans are experiencing assimilation through what I call Stockholm syndrome. We no longer identify with African culture as we have bonded with our captors. Cut loose from the ties of psychological and social bondage that still exists in the United States. The African American experience has separated us so far from the truth, we forgot how to operate as a whole. Our ancestors had a collectivist mindset to ensure the survival of their tribes, but we have been subjugated to forming an individualistic mindset that divides us further and further to the point of no return. What is freedom? Is freedom something that you go your whole life paying for, then at the end, you find out that you were never free to begin with? I don't have all the answers to the problems that we face in the African American community, but I do know one thing for sure. If we don't act as an interdependent community for our children's sake, then the African American experience will continue. Thank you.
But it ain't no drink out there that can numb my soul. Oh no. All we want to do is take the chains off. All we want to do is break the chains off here. All we want to do is be free. All we want to do is be free.